O'er the wild windy sea, I can hear her calling to me. So let's heave away, haul away, and fill our eyes with the shore. Calls to friends, sail and light, and a tale to brighten the night. So heave away, haul away, and heed the siren song.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Siren podcast. I'm your host, David Bradbury, and I've got with me...
your other host, Jack McFarling.
Hell yeah, brother. Today on the Salty Siren, we are beginning a new era, a new general stage of the podcast. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. It's like Shark Week, but better. We're starting our subathon. And by that, I mean for the next several episodes, all you're going to be hearing about are submarines. For those of you who don't like submarines, I guess this is pretty bad news, but hopefully for most of you, it's going to be kind of exciting. We're going to be doing several themed episodes here, kind of in line with our last one on the movie about submarines. This time, we're going to be covering a real-life event from... well, probably where the majority of this podcast is going to draw from in the future and in the past, World War II. So, Jack, knowing that this is about submarines and World War II, do you have any guesses as to today's topic?
The only thing, well, the first thing I think of when I think submarine warfare in World War II is probably the movie U-571, and we just did an episode on that. So
if you haven't seen it, go see it or listen to it. We're on Spotify, YouTube, all that stuff. Promotion.
But yes. Yeah, I do not know.
Okay. Well, today's episode is Ramage's Rampage, subtitle The Perfect Storm. I grew up hearing this story from my dad and Late Night History Channel, and it is one of those things where every little detail, every little bit of it is important because it shows what an absolute, perfect mixture of things had to happen for this to succeed.
Did you come up with that title?
I did indeed.
That is a...
well, Ramage's Rampage, I did not. That is what the event is just called. But Ramage's Rampage, The Perfect Storm, that's all me, baby.
Well, regardless, that is a tight title. That is a high octane. I am ready to hear about this.
Oh, yeah. It is a doozy. So, with that being said, what all do you know about U.S. Submarine operations during the war? Are you kind of... aside from U-571 and all the things we covered relating to that, how in-depth would you say your knowledge is?
Kiddie pool depth. I'd put it about there. Yeah, all I know, like you said, from the U-571 episode, these are things I learned while writing that episode, that America had two S-class submarines on the East Coast, and they were lost early in the war, and that's about it.
Yeah. So today we will be covering sort of workhorse 2.0 of the American Submarine Command. And that is a class of ship which I believe is pronounced the Balao class. Balao. Rip me to shreds in the comments if that's not correct, but I believe I'm getting it. And in particular, we are covering one of the first members of the Balao class, the submarine USS Parche. Parche. Also massacre me in the comments if I've gotten that wrong.
Might be the Parche.
Parche. Shit. Edit that out.
Maybe. I don't know.
No, it's definitely the Parche. As soon as you said it, I was like, nope, okay, yeah, the few videos I watched on this definitely said the Parche, so just cut that out. And
or maybe the Parche.
The Parche. Or leave it in. Fuck it. I don't care.
Parche. How about that?
Parchesi. Parmesan cheese. But anyway.
More to come.
More to come. So the USS Parche was built in the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Littery, Maine, with her keel being laid on the 9th of April, 1943. She was one of the U.S. Navy's largest class of submarines that Balao mentioned previously, which was itself an improvement off of the Gato class. The main difference between the two of them was the thickness and strength of the steel in their pressure holes, but we'll get into some details on that later. So, being commissioned and being one of the first of the Balao class put to water, she was mainly in service in 1943 through 1944 and was entirely in the water post-Battle of Midway. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Battle of Midway is, why are you listening to this podcast? But two, the Battle of Midway being over meant that Japan's ability to really sort of support and protect their own supply lines had been massively diminished. With the huge losses they took, it pretty much meant that the U.S. Navy was of the mindset that they could kind of borrow German U-boat tactics and just wreak havoc on Japanese supply lines by creating what are known as wolf packs. Wolf packs are typically 3 submarines which operate in kind of like a loose group together. They have a decent amount of autonomy between the ships, but kind of communicate amongst themselves and in general try to coordinate attacks. Weirdly enough, with submarines, the not tight cohesion of a wolf pack actually makes them massively more effective in World War II. Because without the hyper advanced, detection stuff that we have with modern day vessels, it was really, really hard to tell where a submarine was coming from or if there was even one near you. So usually what would happen is the first of a wolf pack would spot a juicy target. And it would relay the coordinates of the juicy target to the other members of the wolf pack, and they would all begin to converge on it. The one who spotted it was usually the closest, and so would attack first. But once they had sort of made their torpedo run, they would just submerge and get the hell out of Dodge. And so usually that meant that the whole convoy or target was in chaos and disarray and sometimes damaged when another submarine from the wolf pack would hit it from a completely different angle because it had just come in from wherever it was at the time. And then finally, the third one was kind of meant to work as cleanup duty. Typically they'd surface, try and get a really good look, which ones are damaged, which ones are already sinking, finish off any ones that are damaged, and just kind of do whatever damage, create whatever havoc you can before you just leave.
And fun fact, they used a system of code words to determine how juicy a target was. So it started at like the very bottom, which was,
Whoa, big mama.
It started with like overcooked beef brisket, like just completely dry, nothing there.
Sawdust.
and it went all the way up to Big Mama Tangerine.
Oh hell yeah. What a system. The Japanese would have no idea what was going on. But when getting back to our submarine of study here, the Parch was assigned to an initial wolf pack with USS Tenosa and USS Bang. And pretty quickly, they found a good amount of success with, just by April 29th, so 20 days later, the Wolfpack had their first engagement and sunk one unknown Japanese vessel. On the May 3rd, they had another successful hunt, sinking the Taiyoku Maru and the Shoryu Maru, both of which significant fuel tankers, and several other hits scored on the convoy. Post-war, their first deployment would give them a credit of 30,542 tons worth of ships sunk. The fun thing about just like submarines in World War II as well is that they kind of had a leaderboard. They effectively competed amongst themselves to see what the maximum tonnage of ships they could sink was. And you kind of moved up the leaderboard, got more acclaim, more notoriety. The higher you were, the higher number of tons of ships you had sunk. So 30,542 is that's no chump change. That's a good amount. But after that engagement, the Parch returned to Midway and underwent a refit when they just upgraded a few things, changed a few things around, which we'll also cover that a bit more later, and finally had a return to sea on the 17th of June. This time, Parch was moved around to a new wolf pack, which consisted of the submarines USS Hammerhead and USS Steelhead. The coordinated attack group for these was commanded by Commander Lewis Parks, with the trio earning the nickname Parks's Pirates. The commander of the Parch, who we'll also get to later, well, I suppose we can say his name. Let's see here. I'd put it further down like a dumbass, so let me scroll through my notes. Ramage. Ramage, the commander of the Parch, argued that they should have the nickname the Headhunters because of the two other vessels being Hammerhead and Steelhead, and Ramage himself making the third head being a redhead. But Parks Pirates was the name that stuck, and so the second patrol would set out and prove to be a bit more dangerous for Parch, with a short surface engagement resulting in the sinking of an unknown Japanese patrol vessel, which fought back unlike their previous targets, along with a close brush with danger against an unknown Japanese cruiser and destroyer pair, where USS Parch was bombarded and depth-charged on the 4th of July. So they got their fireworks, just not happy ones.
Yeah, how could a submarine convoy not be successful when we got names like this flying around?
I know, dude.
Hammerhead, Steelhead.
Yeah, they're badass, and I think Parch, if I'm remembering right, was named for a particular admiral's daughter. I really should have written that down, but oh well. Anyway, the three of them, after their close brush with danger, were able to pretty much escape unscathed, and Parch was able to return to her patrol with her second wolf pack. It was this combination of encounters that slightly altered USS Parch's path, and the path of the wolf pack as a whole. And this would lead them to be in prime position for the events that followed. But first, I thought we would kind of go over just like the submarines themselves, like the specifications of them, what made them significant in this instance, and just a little bit of background on the people involved. So essentially, the Belau-class submarines were an upgraded version of their predecessors, which was the Gato class. Improvements, as previously mentioned, were around tougher steel being used in the pressure hull skins, and frame reinforcements, which led to a pretty significant improvement in maximum depth. They used what was called test depth, which, from my understanding, it was kind of hard to find an exact definition of it. They varied quite a bit, but it was basically, this is as deep as we're comfortable taking it during a test without possibly killing everyone on board. So the Gato class had been able to reach a test depth of 300 feet, and the reinforcements to the Belau class allowed it to reach 400 feet. And granted, test depth was not a maximum depth, and also, as we'll get to later, the Belau class, basically no two of them were the same, and one particular Belau class, the USS Tang, managed a 612-foot test depth. And later in the war, during actual combat, far exceeded that depth while running from a destroyer's depth charges, and survived. And later met a very unfortunate fate, which we'll also get to. The Belau class, as I kind of talked about this whole time, really simultaneously suffered and benefited from the Navy basically doing like shipyard field testing, kind of, that they would just constantly be working on upgrades, side grades, and reconfigurations, just really trying to figure out like what was the best way to do X, what could we make an improvement on Y, some of the crews have complained about Z, what can we do to alter that? And so you could have two Belau class subs sitting right next to each other, and just like the small variations on them would make them easily identifiable as one ship or another.
Ooh, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it majorly sucked for a few logistics things, in that repair crews would just walk onto a Belau class and be like, what the fuck is this? To some piece that had been slapped on there regarding like a particular problem. Like to the point where they often had completely different engines. So, you know, one of the most integral parts of any vessel, it was different vessel to vessel. They even experimented with entirely electrical propulsion at one point, but those got scrapped before they were ever put into service. Not really certain if that scrapping was due to the engine sucking or not. My bet is yes, but it was also like basically right at the end of World War II. So there's also a good chance that they were like, this could be something, but we just can't be bothered to put the money into it now that the war's ending.
I could just picture an admiral coming to the shipyard, walking into the project manager's office, and the manager's just like doing blow. He's like,
it's like, dude, check this out. We put a fucking 80 millimeter cannon on the front of this one, and he's just like, why?
Yeah.
No, their armament usually stayed the same. It was a few things that like a few notable things that tended to get changed around a lot was the exact configuration of the crew stations in the main deck of the ship, because all the time crews would say like, hey, it's really cramped and uncomfortable and like it sucks and this part gets too congested during like maneuvers and things like that. And so they were constantly being like, well, could we put another door here? Could we switch the bunks to like this position? And so a lot of the small stuff internally was rearranged ship to ship. But also, pretty much all Balau class were equipped with two types of radar. One that was able to detect air targets, and the other that was able to detect surface targets. And so the exact position of those radar antenna, where they were on the ship, what type of antenna was equipped, what sort of reinforcements were given, and all of that also constantly changed around because, again, with different engines with other different specifications, there were some instances where like a Balau class would come under fire and they'd be like, oh fuck, dive, and they'd dive, slam on the throttle, and just like rip off their antenna.
Bruh.
And so it was not ideal, and there was also issues with just how radar worked back then of like, oh well, if we slapped this here, would this like improve it? And so instead of, actually doing testing for this, it was just kind of, well, we're going to put it on your ship and see if it works. Another thing that caused some headaches for the logistical side of things is that the initial run of engines that luckily stopped right before our sort of point of view vessel, but the initial engines had this transmission, or goodness, I wrote down the wrong word there, but effectively like a transmission or a drivetrain that ran from the propellers to the engines themselves, and they were not stress tested hard enough. And so the engines just shredded them in like the initial few vessels put to water. And so they ended up on pretty much all vessels past that point. They ended up installing these sort of like modification boxes that effectively were like an additional gear set to slow down or like reduce the torque that the engine was putting on the propellers and damaging the sort of like rods that ran to the propellers themselves. But the issue is that it made like a really loud rhythmic like noise. And when you're in a submarine and sonar and like noise level can be the difference between you being found and not, that was a big issue. And so there were various different solutions that were just fitted to the ships to try and dampen the noise, because they pretty much couldn't work without that device going. And so you just, every time that you came into the engine room, it was like, all right, what engine's going to be there? And what drivetrain like box version are they running, and what drivetrain box dampening device are they running? And so it just, it made them difficult to work with.
Yeah, I think it's telling, like, of how these submarines were developed. Like, what's probably the most important part of the submarine? Okay, maybe the ballast. Maybe that's the first important part. And probably number 2 is the engine. And they were more concerned with trying out radar configurations.
Yeah, it's tough because by like the later years of the war, so like 1944 onwards, a lot of these issues had been somewhat standardized and somewhat ironed out, but the US over the course of the war made 120 Balao class submarines with roughly, I believe, 60 of those being made in 1944 through 45. So you still had roughly 60 of, the whole like Balao class running around with like earlier modifications, earlier configurations. And so it was pretty common for like, hey, we're coming back into port, and they'd just be like, yep, we're like completely rearranging how some of the shit is on your ship. Don't mind us. And yeah, it was just wild. But another reason that the Balao class was so chaotic was because there's just a general like rule of submarines was that you kind of had to build around the torpedo or like whatever armament you wanted it to carry. As much as you had to build around like, oh, well, we want it to be this depth and we want it to, carry these guns and have these engines, you had to build around the torpedo. And the torpedo was not good. So that also caused some pretty significant issues, which we'll get into here in a second. But another thing that's relevant just for the subathon in general, but particularly for this episode, is submarines, especially, and this is still true today, but especially back in World War II, their maximum speed underwater and their maximum speed at surface level were vastly different from each other. For example, on the Parch, its maximum surface speed was 20.25 knots, which, it ain't bad, but when fully submerged, that max speed dropped to 8.75. Less
Ouch.
than half. And 8.75 is painfully slow. Fuel efficiency also plummeted off a cliff when the submarine was fully submerged. And so they were encouraged, like, hey, anytime that you're not, like, actively being engaged or worried about being spotted, try to run on the surface, because it'll conserve fuel. It's also worth noting that those speeds were only if you were pushing the engines to do everything they could, and that burned a whole lot more fuel than their most efficient mark, which was roughly half speed. So basically, when you weren't in combat, you were running at about 10 knots on the surface, or 4 underwater. But it gets worse. The Balao class, and generally submarines of the day, were pretty much functioned like whales. They had to come up for air. They were still mammals, in a sense. And so they didn't have gills, no way to really produce oxygen while underwater. They had to come up for air. But that air that the crew breathed was also shared with the air required to pump into the engines and supply enough oxygen for combustion. So, if you wanted to have a good amount of time underwater, you needed to run the engines basically as slowly as you could. so that they didn't eat up too much of the oxygen. And that meant that in terms of a long-term dive, the Belau class could stay underwater for 48 hours straight, but only if it moved at 2 knots the entire time. So, with all of that out of the way, you have kind of an understanding of how the Belau class was basically forced to run themselves by their design. They were all slightly different, so the Wolfpack configuration worked pretty well. They could sort of play to their particular version of the Belau's strengths. But on top of that, it meant that the U.S. Submarine Command basically said, hey guys, during the daytime, run underwater painfully slow, usually between 4 to 2 knots, and then at night, surface and cruise around at 10 knots until you spot something, and then dive again, and you can afford to, like, push the engines. But it all comes back, and it's all important, I promise.
I do like the plan of piddle around piddle around until you see something, and then go back underwater,
and then fucking floor it. Like, it's
and it just like, and maybe this is still kind of true today, but you know, there's no like satellite imagery, I guess, so they can't be like, oh yeah, there's this cruiser coming up on these coordinates. They're just like, no, just go out there and look for something, I guess.
Yep. So, the next bit of fun of this perfect storm is really just a bit of backstory, because the bit of perfect storm in this is that the torpedo that the Belau class as a whole was designed around was the Mark 14 torpedo, which the U.S. had developed during the Great Depression in 1931. The reason I mention the Great Depression is that due to kind of the ongoing economic state of the U.S., pretty much everything was getting budget cuts. And the military was not excluded from that, much less so the Navy, because a lot of people were like, hey, we're like, World War I's over, let's go back to just like never interfering with anything going on in other parts of the world. What do we need a Navy for? And so during that time, military budget was slashed, Navy budget was hit particularly hard, and that meant that the Mark 14 torpedo, developed in 1931, got basically the, hey, we designed a torpedo, and like, does it kind of work? Yeah, good enough. And no further testing was done.
Perfect.
Testing was just, in general, less than adequate. They didn't want to spend a lot of money on additional torpedoes, so torpedoes were outfitted with sort of dummy explosives in the place of where the actual explosives would be. Test models were often different from production models because, again, saving costs, and they didn't want to waste all the money on potentially losing or accidentally detonating an actual torpedo, because they're trying to save every penny they could. But as a result of this, the Mark 14 basically did not see testing until it saw the first naval conflicts of the U.S. in World War II. And it had a slew of problems that, again, were a perfect storm in and of themselves. But 4 main ones stuck out above all the rest. And the first 3 kind of feed into each other. The first one was that the Mark IV torpedo tended to run about 10 feet deeper than whatever you set the depth at. And as kind of a brief aside, before modern torpedoes that you can like direct in the water and, you know, basically control like a little RC toy, older torpedoes were just kind of, they go in a straight line, but you could adjust the depth of the torpedo. So this was useful in all sorts of circumstances where you could set a torpedo lower than the hulls of the escort ships, but not lower than the hulls of the big fat merchant vessels or carriers or battleships that were closer to the center. So the torpedo would literally just zoom under and past all of the small shit you didn't care about and hit the big stuff. But the Mark IV ran 10 feet deeper than what you set it at, or more. And that meant that it just went under everything and just didn't hit anything. And so if you read like early sort of submarine engagements in World War II, the U.S. submarine commanders are so pissed because they're like, we fired 6 torpedoes on a massive group of Japanese vessels, and we heard 2 of them detonate, and the rest missed. We're not sure why they missed, but we heard 2 detonate, but also none of the ships seemed damaged. So we then fired a few more, which also missed. And this was after having like corrected and tried to like, well, okay, let's see if, like, let's double and triple check our measurements, make sure we're on target, make sure there's no way this torpedo's going to miss. And it would still miss. So that caused a lot of problems. But for those few torpedoes that did detonate, they didn't seem to do any damage. And this leads into our second problem, which was the Mark IV was equipped with a magnetic detonator that was supposed to cause it to detonate when it got close enough to a ship to deal damage, because that basically allowed you to have a larger degree of error, and it also allowed you to send torpedoes underneath a ship, like intentionally not hitting the side, so that it would blow up and hopefully rupture parts of the ship on the underside, which was virtually impossible to repair once it happened. The problem is, the magnetic sensor was way too sensitive, and so would detect ships way too far out and would just immediately detonate once it got in the general proximity of a vessel, and would detonate far enough away that it just did nothing. The only reason that we really found out that this was something that was happening is because we intercepted enemy vessel transmissions talking about the torpedoes detonating just before hitting the ship. But the magnetic detonator problems kind of got back to the submarine commanders as like, yeah, we think this might be why this is happening. And so they said, okay, well, instead of trying to send them under the ship, we're just going to dial it up so it's basically at the surface. And still, the Mark 14 would sometimes just sail under it. And so they continued to have misses that they just couldn't explain. And even then, some of the crews heard that the magnetic sensor could be the problem. And so in one of the dumbest fucking moves that I have ever heard of, ever, the crews would crack open their own torpedoes and disable the magnetic sensor.
All right.
So basically like directly disobeying orders. Whether or not this was encouraged by their captains is kind of like a question mark, but there were a ton of reported incidences of crews disabling this and it continuing to not work because they also had a contact detonator. So if they just bonk something hard enough, they're supposed to explode. But guess what else didn't work?
I wonder.
So, you had these crews who would fire a salvo of missiles. It would miss, even though they were dead on target. And then it became a thing of what went wrong? What can we fix? They'd hear, oh, the magnetic detonator might be the problem. They'd disable it. They'd then fire the torpedoes. Sometimes they'd still miss. Even if they were on target, they would just hear a doom through the water of the torpedo just fucking hitting the side of a ship like a gong and then not going off. But these first three problems just absolutely fucked the logistics side of things because they were near impossible to tell apart from each other. Because for the submarine crews, they were just launching their torpedoes. Sometimes they were going off too early. Sometimes they were missing entirely when they should have been on target. And sometimes they were hitting their target and not going off. And so it was just like, what is wrong with these? And it didn't help that a lot of submarine captains would fail to report that their crews had disabled the magnetic detonator. And so a lot of the reports of the detonator isn't working, some of those cases were more than likely because the crew screwed something up tampering with it. Some of those cases were because the magnetic detonator wasn't working just flat out. Some of them were that the magnetic detonator was too sensitive. Some of them were that the contact detonator wasn't working when the magnetic detonator failed. And so it just took forever for the U.S. Navy to figure out what the hell was going on. And then all of this leads into the worst problem of them all, which was the Mark 14 had a gyro stabilizer in it, as most torpedoes of that age did. Because when it launches out of the tube, it's pretty much launched out by forced air. And it doesn't come out directly on target all of the time. And so the gyro stabilizer was in there to kind of be like, hey, no, go the direction we pointed you. But also to ensure that the torpedo leveled itself out. And so wasn't heading further down into the water or heading further up towards the surface. But because this controlled depth as well as direction, a malfunction with this was really bad because it meant that it wouldn't work that well. But the specific way, and this is so horrible that I'm laughing at this, but it's just like, how can this, like, literally, how could it be any worse? The specific way that the gyro stabilizer malfunctioned was something that they came to know as circling, where it would jam and cause the torpedo to constantly think that it was off course and needed to correct, which would cause it to fire out and usually rise to the surface where the submarine usually was when launching it, and then it would boomerang back to the submarine.
Oh, dear Lord.
It. And so, in the stupidest and most horrific way possible, the first three errors made the fourth error not as bad as it could have been. Because when it came back and hit you, there still was a good chance that it wouldn't go off. But it did a few times, and so there were multiple reported instances of U.S. destroyers and submarines sinking themselves.
Bruh.
One of these was the previously mentioned Tang, which also in kind of a, like, honestly creepy cosmic way, for being the one that set the depth record for its class, the whole crew died when one of their torpedoes boomeranged or circled on them and slammed into their conning tower. It didn't detonate, but it managed to damage their ballast controls, and in the process caused them to go into an emergency dive, which they could not cancel. Ooh. So the Tang and its whole crew died by just rocketing to the bottom of the ocean until the pressure crushed it. Which is really
the worst possible way to die.
Yeah, just really, really bad. So, aside from, crews tinkering with enough explosives to, rip a hole in a battleship, and aside from the magnetic detonator and the contact detonator and the depth not working and the boomeranging, the Mark 14 wasn't that bad.
Just literally every major component of it doesn't work.
But, the problem
it's steamed hams again. You're telling me that the magnetic the magnetic detonator doesn't work, the shock detonator doesn't work, it drives in circles, and just keeps going.
Yes. May I see it? No. But the part of this that was, like, honestly the most infuriating for me to read about is that the U.S. Navy Admiralty pretty much refused to believe this was a problem for a long while, until there was one particular gentleman who, in my infinite wisdom, I also did not write down his name. Let me see if I can find it real quick on one of my reference documents that I've still got open. Let's see. It was generally Taylor Swede Momsen, and let's see.
That sounds like a JoJo stand.
It kind of does. But him and, god damn it, I can't find his name. I'm sure someone in the comments will really get on me about this, but we'll just move on. The point is, he basically risked his whole career by going to the U.S. Admiralty and be like, yo, these problems are real, these are not working, and it's going to massively hamper our ability to deal with this stuff. And so by sort of just getting on their ass, he was authorized to do a few tests, which were a combination of netting tests where they basically put out like a big old just net and would launch the torpedoes at it, and they would see where the torpedo hit on the net, and just by it punching a hole clean through it. And then they could say, okay, well, we were aiming for this part, so it deviated in this direction and by this much. And it was here that the problem of the depth was finally rectified, because they realized that the settings on all of the torpedoes were calibrated for the dummy warheads, which were a quarter the weight
yeah,
of the real explosives. And so that was causing them to sink way further down than intended. But in a hilarious twist of fate, this was discovered, and then, in order to combat the larger carriers and vessels, and partially because the early detonation problem was causing some parties to believe that the torpedoes simply were not powerful enough, they added explosives to the load of it, and this threw off the depth gauging again. Luckily, they caught that one a lot faster because they were like, oh, whoopsies, and pretty much like readjusted it. But then they were like, okay, we've solved the problem. We did it, Pat. We saved the city. And it was then that they're like, oh, hold on. It's not anything to do with the explosives. It's not anything to do... Well, it is something to do with the depth. But the magnetic exploders are also a problem. And they started working on those. And finally, they basically just said, fuck it, it's not worth it. And so started just not making the torpedoes with those and reverting to the contact exploders. But the great part of this is that it was then that the Navy High Command was like, oh, hey, the contact detonators also don't work. And they discovered through a series of drop tests, which were sort of championed by Taylor Swede Momsen, they would like take basically the nose, all of like the internal parts of the torpedo, they'd haul it up into the air and they'd drop it from an exact height that would cause it to reach the running speed of the torpedo in the water when it would then make contact with the ground.
Yeah, that was a lot more popular than telling Jimmy to drive a Jeep at a torpedo at 30 miles an hour.
Yeah, so they basically just lift the guts of the torpedo up, drop it from the height that it would reach the correct speed at, it'd slam into the earth. And I want you to just take a guess at the percentage that failed to detonate at a 90-degree angle and at optimal speed.
40%? 70. Impressive.
70% failed to detonate at all at 90 degrees, which hilariously enough, they discovered that when at not optimal conditions, for instance, if the torpedo was not falling straight, so not hitting at 90 degrees, or if it was slightly under the optimal running speed, the number of failures was cut in half, down to 35%. So this one was, a little bit easier because while they worked on a fix for it, they basically told all the submarine crews, like, hey, change your approaches, make sure your torpedoes are hitting at a steep angle. Like, try to land a glancing shot because that's actually a better chance of the torpedoes going off. But with that, we get to the end of the saga of the Mark 14, and the final sort of improved version of the Mark 14 was finished in late 1943, first being equipped onto the first generation of Belau-class subs, including Parch. So, Parch was put to water at basically the exact moment that torpedo failure rates went from 70% plus to working as intended. And it's at this point that we get back to Parch and her patrol in late July of 1944. Stay tuned for the events of Ramage's Rampage and the Medal of Honor that followed. next time on The Salty Siren.
Oh, Johnny, Johnny, call and hear the ancient song of sailors long forgone and sailors still to be. A sweet and solemn tune spoke gently by the tide. Oh, Johnny, Johnny, fall, join the song.